You know, the mistake the world makes regarding Christianity is that it tries to dismiss it as nothing more than a holdover, albeit a more organized version of primitive system of responses to human superstition. Now, I'm sure that's a far fancier description than religious critics would offer. To the self-proclaimed sophisticated intellectual elite, Christianity is no different than any other human religion. The eggheads and the cool people will claim that the same themes run through Christianity that run through all of the other major and even some of the not so major world systems of worship. The brilliant and the beautiful simply place Christianity in the general category of religion so it can ignore it as readily as they do the Kachina cult found among the Hopi Native American tribe or Tangaroa god of the ocean worship common among the Maori people of Polynesia. Of course, they say the same thing about Islam and Buddhism, but they do it in a quiet, silent, politically correct way because at the moment, it isn't very acceptable to appear critical or dismissive about, well, any other religion other than Judaism and Christianity. But regardless of all of that, the world simply sees Christianity as nothing more than just one more iteration of ancient responses to primal fears of the unknown. And of course, they're wrong. And here's why I say that. Here's why I say Christianity is at least unique. You see, Christianity has one thing that no other systems of belief and worship ever known to man has: grace. No religion, let me say this, no major religion outside of Christianity preaches forgiveness of sins through faith. And that's what makes Paul's job and my friend Stephen's job and John Piper's job and Chuck Swindoll's job and anyone else out there preaching the gospel's job so difficult. We have to tear down the deeply ingrained concept of works-based salvation, and probably no one has a more difficult time of that than someone who's preaching to those raised in Judaism. Now, it's not all that easy preaching to people raised in Catholicism either, but it's still a walk in the park compared to someone trying to convert, and in Paul's case, preserving the conversion of Jewish people. You see, to most works-based religious adherents, and let's stick with the Jews for this discussion, they represent the do this, don't do that crowd rather nicely. Now, by no means is this exclusively a Jewish issue, but it's going to sound like it for a little bit. Just do me a favor and look inside your own heart, whether you be a Jew or not. Back to my point. The Jewish people absolutely revered their law in Paul's day. Of course, that's largely because they transformed it into a personal badge of honor. They thought the law made them extra special because God gave it to them and to no other. Before long, the law, and I mean adhering to the law, became their national identity. If you followed the law, you were a Jew. If you didn't, you weren't. And by the way, that's not the case anymore. In our modern world, the only qualification is genetic, and devotion to Judaism seems to have no bearing on whether or not you go around telling people you're a Jew. But not so with the ancient Jews. Performing the rites of Judaism was what the Jews did. In fact, circumcision, an important rite in Judaism, a requirement of every male Jew, became synonymous with the Hebrew people. Of course, as we've said, they weren't the only ones who practiced circumcision, but because it was mandated by God as a sign of his covenant with them, they saw it as this exclusive symbol of their importance to God. The point is, the law took on gigantic proportions among the Jewish people, far exceeding the boundaries that God had put around it. Their love of the law nearly reached iconic worship status. And now imagine trying to preach a salvation without works in that atmosphere, a salvation that didn't involve, in fact, discouraged adherence to religious rules and rituals. Wait a second, Paul. Are you trying to tell me that the law was doing nothing for us all those centuries? Of course not. God forbid, certainly not. The law is good. I don't know about that now, Paul. You really got me thinking about this whole do this, don't do that stuff. The law just seems so meaningless now. In fact, it almost feels, well, evil. No, you got me wrong. The problem isn't the law. It's more about our relationship to it. It's not that the law is wrong or malevolent. Not at all. The law isn't the problem. It's sin's fault. In our own dark heart, it's the problem. Sin came in, noticed how we humans react to being told what to do, and it whips us all up. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, so all manner of desire. For without the law, sin was dead. Paul is sticking with his contention that the law is responsible for many of our sin. But it's not that the law caused sin. It's just that somehow it stirs up in us a desire to sin. In fact, the law actually frames what we normally do in terms of right and wrong. The example given is covetousness. Paul says that he had not even known that being down with OPP, other people's property, was coveting. He felt it was just normal to want what belonged to someone else, or at least it was innocent, it was harmless. But the law referred to that sort of behavior as coveting and forbade it, which, by the way, didn't seem to help him a whole lot, because verse 8 says that all that did was stir up even more desires, all sorts of desires. Does that sound like the law would do that? Of course not. It's sin itself. Now, this has been the theme for quite some time. The coming of the law precipitated sin in us. Now, what's the purpose here? Is Paul on some sort of anti-law campaign? Has he decided he must destroy the memory of law? Well, to quote the King James, God forbid. Now, of course, that's not what Paul said, but you know that already. But it's actually not too far off of his sentiment. Let it not be, or certainly not, were a couple of good alternatives we've discussed in the past. the general purpose of creating all of this negative atmosphere around the discussion of the law is to get his readers, and I still say particularly his Jewish readers, to reject the notion that the law can make any difference whatsoever in the heart of men. He's trying to get us to see that the law is powerless to make us into the children of God. It can't save us and it can't sanctify us. The only thing the law can do before we're saved is condemn us. That's why we must be delivered from it. That's why we must change our relationship to it. In this chapter, Paul is countering the notion that somehow the law was given, that any law was given to produce or improve righteousness of humankind. Now, we can assume that many of the Jews were having, second thoughts about salvation by grace. They were used to being taught that the law was going to change them into what God wanted them to be. This idea of grace and faith was such a radical departure from the Judaism of their youth. No doubt, listen to me, the constant and consistent message the converted Jews were hearing from their family and their friends who were not converted yet sounded probably something like this. John, when you were a youth, you loved the law, just like the rest of us. At that time, you believed the law was your ticket to safe passage into the presence of God. What happened? Hasn't the law been good to you your whole life? Well, frankly, no. Sure, the law may have moderated my behavior in some areas out of fear of it, but it's done nothing to make me a better person. At times, I may look righteous on the outside, but inside there's all sorts of sin. You don't see that side of me, but the law does. And because of that, it sentences me to death. Oh, how could you say such things about our precious law? You're killing your mama. All of that had to stop as far as Paul was concerned. All such outside talk ever did was bring about fruit unto death, dragging people back under the condemnation of the law was death dealing. Paul's task is a tough one. How can he show that he truly loves the law while demonstrating the law's deadly hold on his people? Sounds like a mixed message, a confusing, potentially damaging mixed message. Well, this is the point of chapter 7. Yes, we should respect the law, but we must face what the law cannot do for us. It cannot make us anything but condemned corpses. In summary, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law. For I had not known lust except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. And then he says something very enigmatic. For without the law, sin was dead. Very enigmatic, very confusing. Well, I think there are two vital keys to understanding Paul's point. Number one, context, of course. And number two, word meaning. Let's start with that first one. If you took this statement out of context, as many do, I think you, in so doing, make it a very confusing and inconsistent assertion. If I walked up to someone and just blurted out, without the law, sin is dead, then that person that I was speaking to would say, fine, then don't tell me anything about the law because I don't want to be a sinner. If I don't know anything about the law, then I'm not a sinner. The danger is that someone can interpret this to mean, as long as you don't know what you're doing is wrong, then it isn't wrong. And of course, that's not the case. For God, wrong is wrong. Remember, he judges by truth. This statement about sin being dead without the law is surrounded by what one might call personal testimony. I'm talking about context now, as that key is one of the keys to understanding what Paul is saying. We already determined that Paul didn't mean, as long as you don't know the law, just go ahead and do whatever you want to, because if you don't know it's a sin, it's not a sin. That's not the case. We're still trying to figure out what he means. And so I say, notice that this is personal testimony. The personal pronoun is used everywhere. It's used before and it's used after the statement. And that can only mean, well, not only mean, but it most likely means this is a personal statement. And if you go back and read it that way, I think that's the impression you get. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin, but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence. For without the law, sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and by it slew me. Now, I just want to make mention that the last appearance of that word me there, and what's that, verse 11? In my Bible, it's in the italics, which means it was added by the translators. In other words, it was not a part of the original statement. And so, like all words in italics in the King James, it is interpretive and not translative, which is fine, of course, because it's a good translation. And I say that because of the context. Paul left it out of the original statement because he knew we would know what he meant, whether he added the word me at the end of that statement or not. Apparently, the King James folks weren't as confident of that as Paul was, so they went ahead and added the personal pronoun me, but did so in italics to make sure you and I knew that it wasn't in the original. Honest, good interpretation. So, what you must get from this whole thing is that Paul is talking about a personal experience or a personal viewpoint of how sin and the law affected someone. We still don't know for sure if Paul is speaking of himself or if he's sort of performing a dramatic scene for effect. This carries on all the way through the rest of the chapter. And by the way, as I've promised, by the time we're finished, I will give you my personal opinion as to which it is. And I'm not trying to be dramatic or stagey about this, but I'm honest with you. I'm still not 100% certain what I believe. And I was hoping that you and I could work this out together. All right, back to our current discussion. The context of this section of chapter 7 is that of personal reflection, personal observation, personal conclusion. So it's best to assume that when Paul said, without law, sin is dead, What is meant is a personal reflection, a personal observation, a personal conclusion, just like the verses around this statement. That's why we can't take it out of context, because it's meant to reside in this personal testimony involved in all these several other verses. Therefore, it would seem to me for this person, whoever it is, without the law, sin in his life was dead. His or her sin, this is what this means. His or her sin was not perceived as being alive when the law was not a factor for them. It didn't appear to affect them. Now, this statement doesn't seem to be of universal application. That's not to say it isn't. It's just that from what we can gather from the context, it's a statement that applies in a personal way, dare I say, an individual way. Now, if you don't agree with me, I don't blame you. In fact, I wouldn't even fight you on it. This is one of those spots that I don't feel I'm standing on solid ground with my interpretation. But what I'm trying to explain in this section is what Paul means that sin wasn't alive, sin was dead when there was no law. Wrong is wrong. Sin did exist. It's just the way it was perceived by the person who's involved in this narrative. It's not that way for everybody, but for this person, it felt like there was no such thing as sin because he didn't have any rules that told him it was sin. Again, I'll say this is a tough section of Scripture. All right, now that's the first key, context. We used context to help our interpretation of a sticky spot. Now, we didn't get close, but we did better than if we didn't consider the context. What about the second key to our interpretation of this verse? Word definition. Well, as you are all well aware, the English word sin is translating some form of the Greek word hamartia. The literal meaning of the word hamartia is falling short. You've heard this so many times before, but let me explain quickly. In this context, falling short means to miss a certain goal or ideal or target. Think of an archery range. When the archer pulls that bow back and lets fly the arrow, it either hits the target or it doesn't. If I'm shooting it, it doesn't. If he performs poorly on his task of hitting that target downrange, very often the arrow doesn't even make it all the way to where that archer would score points. Out there on the target, there are points. When it falls short, no points, no reward, nothing is achieved. It is possible, when failing for a variety of reasons, that arrow will fall short, and when it falls short, the one shooting the arrow will not be awarded any points. That is precisely what we do hundreds of times a day. God has an ideal in mind for us, a target, a goal for our lives. And in the living of our lives, we fall short of that ideal consistently. And as a result, listen to me, we miss out on the prize given to those who do not fall short. So pulling my interpretation together, we can say that this person speaking here, it might be Paul, we don't know. Sounds like Paul is speaking of himself, whatever. In this person's life, he never felt he fell short until he was told by the law that he fell short. The law came along and said, you have fallen short. Here's what you do. Here's what God says you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to lust. I lust all the time. What do you mean? Paul says, you lust, it's coveting. Oh my gosh, I fall short then. John, that's just utterly ridiculous. No one needs to be told that they fall short of God's ideal. When I was a young Catholic, I would very often pray to Mary. I would ask her to advocate for me with her son. I was told by my religious leaders that this would do a good thing for me. I would over and over repeat what I called the Hail Mary. You know that one. You don't have to even be a Catholic to recognize the prayer I'm referring to. Not only that, but I remember kissing statues and pictures of what I was told was Jesus and looking up and speaking to paintings of what I was told was Jesus. And in all of that, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being reverent. I thought it was being worshipful when I bowed at the altar or kneeled before a priest. And it wasn't until years later that I discovered that God said in his word that I shall not have any idols before him, meaning praying to statues and pictures of Jesus as if they were him was actually falling short. Didn't know that. I didn't know about that sort of thing until I didn't know I was worshiping idols until somebody told me. It wasn't until years later that I discovered that God said in his word that there's but one mediator between God and man, and that is Jesus, and that praying to anyone else, even someone as wonderful as the mother of Jesus, even those amazing apostles who later the church said were given special status as saints, even praying to such godly people is actually falling short. Sometimes we need to be told that what we're doing is a sin, because before that, we're just ignorant. And unfortunately, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And I believe that's what Paul's point is here. The law is so condemnatory that not even not knowing you're subject to the law can save you. You can't be saved by your ignorance. Sin is an absolute, not a matter of choice. The devil wants you to believe that as long as you think you're holy, then you are. He's always tried to peddle that nonsense. He's always tried to tell us that we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. All right, so this has been a lot. It feels repetitive, and that will continue. The repeating will be repeated. But this is purposeful. We must get this drilled into our heads, because it's very easy to slip away from its truth. Knowing the forces that are coming against you is essential to your deliverance. Something as wonderful as the law can be used by the devil and sin to derail your journey. Sorry, but more of this to come next time. I'm not really sorry. See you then.